Some people just see the world differently. Stanley had always been one of those people. He had this knack for turning the most mundane moments into epic sagas. A broken fence? That wasn't just damage. It was evidence of a vicious dog chase. A stubbed toe? A harrowing tale of endurance. But when he called me last Friday, his usual theatrics were nowhere to be found. His voice was quiet, steady, and heavier than I'd ever heard it. "Chris, you've got to come to the party tonight," he said. No witty remarks, no playful jabs. Just that stark, unfamiliar seriousness. I hesitated. I hadn't felt like socializing lately. Things with Ginger had been strange for weeks. We weren't arguing exactly, but the tension between us was suffocating. It was like trying to hold on to water. It kept slipping through my fingers no matter how hard I tried to hold on. Stanley didn't let up. "Trust me on this. Okay? Be there," he pressed, his tone almost pleading. When I told Ginger, she lit up like a spark had reignited. "A party? God, we need this. We've been so dull lately." She laughed, pulling out that red dress she hadn't worn in months. It clung to her perfectly, and she looked incredible. But when she smiled at me, something felt off. It was too polished, like a performance meant for someone else. By the time we arrived at Stanley's place, it was already packed. The living room was a mess of blaring music, spilled drinks, and people shouting over the chaos. Stanley's parties were always wild, but something about this one felt different. It was like there was an undercurrent, a tension humming beneath it all, as if everyone was sharing a secret I wasn't in on. Stanley greeted us with his signature enthusiasm, pulling me into a quick hug before turning to Ginger. His smile widened as he looked her over, his eyes lingering just a second too long. "Ginger," he said, his voice oozing charm. "Wow, you look. I almost didn't recognize you." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, laughing lightly. "What can I say? When I feel like it, I clean up well." It was a small, casual exchange, but something about it made my stomach twist. Before I could process it, Stanley clapped me on the shoulder. "Drinks are in the kitchen. Bro, make yourself at home." The night drifted by in a blur. Ginger seemed to shine, moving from group to group, her laugh cutting through the music like a melody I couldn't tune out. I tried to unwind, catching up with old friends, nursing a beer, but my attention kept snapping back to her. She was alive in a way I hadn't seen in ages, her energy electric, magnetic. Then, across the room, I saw her standing close, too close, to some guy I didn't recognize. He leaned in, saying something I couldn't hear, and she smiled, her hand lightly resting on his arm. My chest tightened. "It's nothing," I told myself. "She's just being friendly." But that uneasy feeling refused to leave. An hour later, I realized I hadn't seen her in a while. I wandered through the house, weaving between the clusters of people, checking the kitchen, the backyard, even the long line for the bathroom. Nothing. Anxiety churned in my gut as I climbed the stairs. Stanley always had a strict no upstairs rule during his parties, so I wasn't expecting to find her there. But as I reached the top, I heard muffled voices behind one of the closed doors. My heart thudded in my chest as I approached. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. 100 scenarios raced through my mind, each one more absurd than the last. And then I heard it, her laugh. Soft, low, unmistakable. I couldn't bring myself to open the door. Instead, I turned around and headed back downstairs, my chest tightening with every step. I found Stanley in the kitchen, surrounded by a group of girls, pouring shots and grinning like he owned the world. His face lit up when he saw me, but his smile faltered when he caught my expression. "What's wrong, man? You look like you've seen a ghost," Stanley said, his tone playful, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that made my skin crawl. "Where's Ginger?" I asked, trying to keep my voice as steady as possible. He shrugged, the motion too casual to be convincing. "I don't know. Around, probably." "Why?" The knot in my stomach twisted tighter. "I thought I heard her upstairs." Stanley's grin widened, but it felt hollow, like it was just for show. "Relax, bro. She's probably just getting some air. You're wound up way too tight." grab a drink and chill. Something about his tone, so smug, so dismissive, made my fists clench. I wanted to wipe that grin off his face, but instead, I swallowed my anger, grabbed another beer, and forced myself to stay downstairs. The rest of the night passed in a blur. My smiles were fake, my conversations half-hearted. I couldn't focus on anything except Ginger and the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. She didn't resurface until it was time to leave. Out of nowhere, she appeared, her cheeks flushed, her hair slightly tousled. "Sorry," she said breathlessly. "I lost track of time." "Where were you?" I asked sharper than I meant to. Her eyes widened, startled. "Just talking to some people." "Why?" I wanted to press her, to demand answers, but the way she looked at me, like I was overreacting, like I was imagining things, made me swallow my frustration. The drive home was silent, the kind of silence that felt like it could suffocate. When we got back, she climbed into bed and fell asleep almost instantly, but I stayed up, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Stanley's words kept echoing in my head. "Relax, man. She's probably just getting some air." But I wasn't buying it. Something was wrong. I could feel it, and I was going to find out what. The next morning, Ginger was back to her usual self, gliding around the kitchen with a breezy confidence that felt almost mocking. She hummed softly as she poured her coffee, the tension from the night before seemingly erased from her memory. Meanwhile, I sat at the table, watching her like she was a stranger. My thoughts were still tangled up in last night, her disappearance, her flushed face when she came back downstairs, the way Stanley had smirked at me like he held some secret I didn't. "You're awfully quiet this morning," she said, setting a plate of toast in front of me. I forced a weak smile. "Just tired." She nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. "Yeah, me too. Last night was fun though, wasn't it? We should do stuff like that more often." Fun. The word sat bitter on my tongue. I wanted to ask her outright, where she'd gone, what she'd been doing, but I held back. If I accused her without proof, she'd just turn it around, make me feel like I was the one imagining things. I needed more than gut feelings. So I nodded. Yeah, it was fun. The rest of the day was a struggle. I couldn't focus on anything. Every time I tried to work, my thoughts circled back to that laugh I'd heard behind the door and the too casual way Stanley had brushed me off. By evening, I'd made up my mind. I needed answers, and I couldn't wait any longer. My first move was Ginger's phone. I'd never been the type to snoop, it wasn't who I was, but this was different. Desperation does strange things to a man. She'd left her phone charging in the bedroom while she showered. My heart was pounding as I picked it up, my hands trembling. I swiped past the lock screen, only to be met with a password. I tried her birthday. Wrong. Then I went for our anniversary. Still wrong. My stomach churned as I stared at the screen. She'd never been secretive about her passwords before. Why would she change it now? Before I could think of another combination, I heard the water shut off. Panicking, I placed the phone exactly where I'd found it and left the room, pretending to be busy in the kitchen. Later that night, when Ginger was asleep, I decided to try again. This time, I went for her laptop, which she always left unlocked on the dining table. I opened her laptop and started searching through everything. Emails, messages, social media accounts. It was spotless, too spotless. It felt deliberate, like she'd gone out of her way to scrub any evidence of what she was up to. My frustration was mounting, and I was about to give up when a notification popped up in the corner of the screen. It was from WhatsApp. The preview showed a message from someone saved as KL. "Last night was perfect. Can't wait to see you again." My blood turned to ice. I clicked on the notification, desperate for more, but it redirected me to a login page. She wasn't logged into WhatsApp on her laptop. Of course not. Ginger was too careful to leave anything that incriminating lying around. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. Kale. Who the hell was Kale? My mind scrambled for answers. Could it be someone from yoga? Or maybe a friend she hadn't mentioned? Then, a flash of memory hit me. The guy at the party, the one leaning in close, whispering in her ear. Was it him? I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, that message echoed in my mind. Last night was perfect. I wanted to shake her awake, demand an explanation, but I held back. Not yet. The next morning I decided to test the waters. Over breakfast I kept my tone casual. Hey, do you remember that guy you were talking to at the party? Tall, dark hair, leather jacket. Ginger blinked, caught off guard. Oh yeah, I think so. Why? I shrugged, feigning indifference. Seemed friendly. She laughed, but it was too quick, too practiced. Oh, stop. He was just making small talk. You know how people are at parties. I forced a smile, pretending to let it slide. She didn't ask why I brought him up, didn't even seem worried. That should have put me at ease, but it didn't. Instead, it felt like she was a step ahead, keeping up the performance, making sure the mask didn't slip. The rest of the day was a blur. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything except that message. When I finally got home, I was teetering on the edge. Ginger greeted me at the door with a kiss, her smile bright and effortless, like everything was fine. For a fleeting second, I almost believed her. But then her phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down at the screen and smiled. A small, subtle smile, but it was enough to send my blood boiling. Who's that? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She glanced over her shoulder, slipping the phone into her pocket. Oh, just Andrea. She wants me to cover her yoga class tomorrow. The lie rolled off her tongue so smoothly that, if I hadn't seen that message the night before, I might have believed her. But now I knew better. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. You've been on your phone a lot lately? I said lightly, trying to keep my tone conversational. Everything okay? There was a pause. Barely a beat, but just long enough to make my stomach churn. Then she smiled, that same polished, practiced smile. Yeah, everything's fine. Just work stuff, mostly. I nodded, pretending to accept her answer. But inside I was a storm. If she thought I wasn't catching on, she was sorely mistaken. That night, after she went to bed, I grabbed my phone and sent a text to Stanley. We need to talk. Now. He responded almost immediately. What's up? I didn't bother with pleasantries. Who's KL? There was a long pause. The dots appeared, disappeared, then reappeared. Finally, his reply came through. Not over text. Come over tomorrow. That was all I needed. Something was going on, something big. And Stanley knew exactly what it was. Tomorrow I'd get the truth, even if it shattered everything in the process. The following morning was nothing short of torture. I went through the motions at work, staring blankly at my computer screen, typing and deleting the same sentence over and over. Lunch sat untouched on my desk, my appetite obliterated by the storm of anger, fear, and paranoia swirling in my mind. Stanley's cryptic text haunted me. Not over text. Come over tomorrow. What did that even mean? Whatever it was important enough for him to avoid leaving a trail. That alone sent chills down my spine. Ginger had been as cheerful as ever when I left for work. She kissed me on the cheek, her smile radiant, as if everything in our world was perfect. But it wasn't. She was lying to my face, pretending, while I was unraveling piece by piece. I couldn't even look at her without my stomach turning. By the time I parked in Stanley's driveway after work, my nerves were shot. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned ghostly white. His house was unusually quiet, a suffocating stillness that only added to my unease. I sat in the car for a minute, trying to compose myself, my breath shallow and uneven. Before I could knock, Stanley opened the door. His face was grim, his usual carefree demeanor replaced by something that reminded me of the day we buried our father. He didn't say a word, just stepped aside and gestured for me to come in. The air inside was heavy, oppressive. He led me to the kitchen, where 2 beers were waiting on the counter. You're going to need this, he said, sliding one toward me. I didn't touch it. Just tell me what's going on, Stanley? I demanded, my voice strained. He sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Look, man, I didn't know how to say this. I've been sitting on it for weeks. It's been eating me alive. Stop stalling. My voice came out like a whip, cutting through his guilty preamble. What do you know? Stanley met my gaze, his expression a tangled mess of shame and pity. It's Ginger, he said finally. My stomach dropped, a cold void opening up inside me. What about Ginger? He hesitated, then grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling as he tapped a few times. Here, he said, holding it out to me. See for yourself. I took the phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep a grip. On the screen was a video. At first, it didn't make sense. The camera was shaky, the lighting dim. But then the image came into focus. Ginger. She was on Stanley's couch, laughing, her hand resting lightly on the thigh of a man I didn't recognize. He leaned into her, whispering something in her ear, his hand sliding up her leg. She didn't push him away. She didn't even flinch. She smiled, leaned closer. She looked like she wanted it. The video ended abruptly, leaving me staring at the dark screen, my breath caught in my throat. My mouth was dry, my chest so tight it felt like I couldn't breathe. When was this? I rasped, barely able to force the words out. 2 weeks ago, Stanley said quietly. I didn't know if I should tell you. At first, I thought it was just some stupid, drunken mistake. But then, he trailed off. But then what? I snapped, my voice sharper now, cutting through his hesitation. Stanley shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my eyes. At the party, he said, his tone barely above a whisper. What about the party? I demanded, leaning forward, my anger flaring. He hesitated again, visibly struggling with the weight of his confession. I threw that party to show you, he admitted finally. I thought if you saw her flirting with other guys, you'd start to get suspicious. I didn't know how else to make you see it, Chris. His words hit me like a freight train. You threw a party to set me up? To make me look like a F********************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************** that?" he said quickly. But it was exactly like that. And now, everything was unraveling faster than I could handle. "Then what is it like, Stanley?" I shouted, my voice bouncing off the walls of his eerily quiet house. "You knew she was cheating, and instead of telling me like a normal person, you turned my life into a circus. You made me the clown." "I was trying to help you," Stanley yelled back, slamming his beer onto the counter so hard I thought the bottle might shatter. "Do you think this was easy for me? Watching you wander around like some blind fool while she made a mockery of your marriage." His words hit like a knife to the chest, cutting deep. For a moment, all I could do was stand there, trembling with fury. "So who is he?" I demanded, my teeth clenched. Stanley hesitated, his eyes darting away like he was searching for an escape. "His name's Kyle," he finally muttered. "She calls him Kale on her phone. He's some guy from her yoga studio. They've been seeing each other for a while." The name hit me like a sledgehammer. Kyle. In my mind, I could hear Ginger's voice, light and flirtatious, laughing as she said his name. I felt sick. "How do you know all this?" I pressed, my voice low and cold. Stanley wouldn't meet my eyes. "Because I've seen them together," he admitted. "She doesn't even try to hide it when you're not around. She brings him to the house sometimes. When you're at work." The room spun. My house. My home. The place I thought was mine, ours. "You should have told me the second you knew," I growled, slamming my fist on the counter. The impact echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. "I know." Stanley's voice cracked, his guilt bubbling to the surface. "I know I screwed up, okay? But I didn't want to destroy your life unless I was sure. And now you know." Silence fell like a shroud over the room. The weight of everything, the lies, the betrayal, the humiliation, pressed down on me, suffocating. I couldn't stay here any longer. "I need to go," I said, my voice hollow. "Chris, wait. Don't." I snapped, cutting him off with a glare that could have burned a hole through him. "Just don't." I walked out, leaving him standing there, and drove home with my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The image of Ginger and Kyle on that video was seared into my mind, playing on an endless loop. My vision blurred, tears threatening to fall, but I refused to let them. When I stepped inside, Ginger was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone like it was any other night. She looked up and smiled, the picture of casual innocence. "Hey babe," she said brightly. "How was Stanley's?" Her nonchalance made my blood boil. My fists clenched at my sides as I fought the urge to explode. I wanted to shout the truth, shove the betrayal in her face. But I didn't. Not yet. I forced a smile. Fine. Just fine. Because now I wasn't just angry, I was determined. If she thought she could lie to me, manipulate me, and walk away unscathed, she was dead wrong. This wasn't over. Not even close. The next morning, I woke up with a strange, simmering clarity. The rage hadn't gone anywhere. It was still there, smoldering under my skin, but now it had a direction. Last night's confrontation with Stanley had given me something I hadn't had in weeks. Certainty. Ginger was lying to me, and I finally had a name. Kyle. I didn't just want answers anymore. I wanted her to feel the crushing weight of her lies, the same weight that had been suffocating me. When I walked into the kitchen, Ginger was already awake, standing at the stove, flipping pancakes as if everything was fine. Her chipper voice grated on me like nails on a chalkboard. "Morning," she chirped. "I made your favorite." I stood there for a moment, staring at her. She looked so normal, so calm. How could she act like this, like nothing was wrong? Did she even feel a shred of guilt? "You didn't have to do that," I said, keeping my tone carefully neutral as I poured myself a cup of coffee. She shrugged, her smile easy and infuriating. Felt like being a good wife today. I almost laughed. A good wife. If only she knew how much those words dripped with irony. But I held my tongue, letting the charade play out. For now. The irony of her words almost made me laugh, but I bit it back, taking a long sip of coffee instead. I kept my eyes on her, watching out of the corner of my vision. Her phone rested on the counter, just within reach. "You got plans today?" I asked casually, leaning against the counter as if the question was meaningless. "Not really," she replied, flipping another pancake. "I might head to the studio later. Andrea needs me to cover for her again." There it was again, that same rehearsed lie, delivered with just enough nonchalance to sound convincing. I nodded faintly, letting my lips curl into a faint smile. "That's nice of you." She turned to face me, setting a plate of pancakes on the table with a cheerful smile. "What about you? Busy day?" "Yeah," I said, sitting down and picking up my fork. "Pretty swamped. Might have to work late." Her phone buzzed. I watched as her eyes darted to it. A quick, reflexive glance. Too quick. Then, almost on autopilot, she flipped it face down and said nothing. I made a mental note of the timing. It was always the same. The phone buzzed. Her mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, and then she'd cover it up with a stream of meaningless chatter. This time, I decided to push a little. "Who's texting you so early?" I asked between bites, keeping my tone deliberately casual. For the briefest moment, she froze. Then came the practiced smile. "Oh, it's just Andrea," she said smoothly. "She's confirming the schedule for today." I nodded slowly, filing the lie away in my mental vault. "Andrea sure texts you a lot lately," I commented, letting the words hang just enough to make her squirm. She laughed nervously, sitting across from me. "Yeah, well, she's stressed. Things at the studio have been crazy." I bet they are, I thought, keeping my expression neutral as I locked eyes with her. The more I watched her, the more cracks I saw in the perfect facade she was trying so desperately to maintain. She wasn't as seamless as she thought. When she stood to clear the plates, I saw my chance. Her phone was still sitting face down on the counter. "Hey, I'll get those," I said, standing and reaching for the plates. She smiled sweetly. "Oh, thanks," she said, turning back toward the sink without a second thought. With her back turned, I slid her phone off the counter and into my pocket, my movements casual despite the adrenaline coursing through me. My hands trembled as I carried the plates to the sink, willing myself to act normal. "I'm gonna hop in the shower," I said as I brushed past her. "Okay," she replied, already humming a tune as she started tidying up. The moment I was out of sight, I bolted upstairs and locked myself in the bathroom. Her phone felt like a live grenade in my hands, seconds away from exploding. I tried the password again, her birthday. Wrong. Our anniversary. Wrong again. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to think. What would she use? Something simple, something meaningful, but not too obvious. Then it hit me. Stanley's birthday. I typed it in and the phone unlocked. My stomach dropped as the home screen lit up. Her WhatsApp was already open to a chat with KL. I didn't hesitate. Scrolling up, I found a full log of their conversations. It wasn't a fling, it was an affair. Months of messages painted a picture of something deep, deliberate, and insidious. They talked about everything. The lies she'd told me, the places they'd meet, how much she missed him. And then, there was the most recent message. "Yesterday was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. When can I see you again?" My stomach churned as I scrolled further. There were pictures too. Not explicit, but intimate enough to make my blood boil. There she was in the red dress she'd worn to Stanley's party, smiling into the camera like she didn't have a husband waiting for her at home. I kept scrolling, each message digging the knife deeper. And then I found it. "He suspects something," she'd written about a week ago. Kyle's response was immediate. "Don't worry about him. Just keep playing your part." The message hit me like a freight train. It wasn't just the lies. It wasn't just the months of deceit. She and Kyle were mocking me, treating me like a joke, like I didn't even exist. My hands clenched around her phone, trembling as I stared at the screen, my vision blurred by a blinding fury. I was ready to storm downstairs, throw the phone in her face, and unload every furious word I'd been holding back. But then I saw the next message. "He's working late tomorrow. Come over after." Kyle's response was brief and smug. "See you then." I froze. They were planning to meet tomorrow. In my house. My sanctuary. Something inside me snapped. The rage that had been simmering for weeks boiled over, but it wasn't the kind that made you scream or lash out. It was cold, controlled, calculating. If they wanted to play me for a fool, I'd give them one last act. But this time, the curtain would drop on my terms. I deleted the messages I'd read and carefully put her phone back on the counter, ensuring everything looked untouched. Then I went about my day as if nothing had happened. When Ginger turned to me with her usual sweet smile, I returned it like nothing was wrong, even kissing her goodbye as I left for work. But I had no intention of going to the office. Instead, I parked my car down the street, out of sight, and waited. Sitting a block away from my own house was surreal. My heart was pounding, my palms slick against the steering wheel, but my focus had never been sharper. Every nerve in my body was on high alert. I had spent the entire night planning every detail. This wasn't just anger anymore, it was strategy. I wanted to watch their web of lies unravel, and I would be the one to light the match. When Ginger kissed me goodbye that morning, she was completely oblivious. I told her, "Don't wait up for me. I've got a long day," and she believed it. She didn't notice I hadn't even brought my laptop. At 11:45 a.m., I saw her leave the house, her yoga mat tucked under her arm. It was her usual routine, heading to the studio for what she always called her lunchtime class. But today I wasn't buying it. I watched her car disappear down the street, my grip tightening on the wheel. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. What if I was wrong? What if she really was just going to yoga? What if Stanley had misunderstood everything? But then I remembered the text. "He's working late tomorrow. Come over after." No, I wasn't wrong. She was counting on me being gone all day, and Kyle was her next move. At 12:30 p.m., a sleek black sedan pulled into my driveway. My breath hitched as I watched the driver step out. He was tall, dark-haired, mid-30s, wearing a leather jacket that screamed overconfidence. His sunglasses caught the midday sun, reflecting it back like a taunt. He strode up to my front door as if he owned the place, knocked once, and then let himself in. "Kyle." My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles turned white. For a split second, I wanted to charge into the house, rip him out by his smug collar, and throw him into the street. But I forced myself to stay calm. I needed more than anger, I needed proof. Undeniable, irrefutable evidence. I waited exactly 5 minutes, my pulse racing, and then quietly stepped out of the car. My adrenaline was spiking, but I kept my movements measured and deliberate as I walked toward the house. Every step felt like a countdown, each one bringing me closer to the confrontation I'd been dreading and planning for. This time, they wouldn't see me coming. I slid the key into the lock, turning it slowly to avoid making any noise. The door opened with a faint creak, but the house was quiet, unnaturally so. My heart was pounding as I stepped inside, my shoes silent against the hardwood floor. The faint murmur of voices drifted from the living room, low and indistinct, but just loud enough to guide me. My pulse hammered in my ears as I crept down the hallway, staying close to the wall. My phone was already recording, capturing every word. As I moved closer, the voices sharpened into focus. "So, when's your next business trip?" Kyle's voice was thick with smugness, laced with sarcasm. Ginger laughed softly, the sound light and playful. "Next week," she said. "He's got no clue as always. Honestly, it's almost too easy." My jaw tightened until it felt like my teeth might crack. Her tone was carefree, casual, like she was sharing a joke. Except this wasn't a joke. She was tearing apart our marriage, piece by piece, without a shred of guilt. "Does he ever suspect anything?" Kyle asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. There was a pause, just long enough for me to feel the sting of her hesitation. "Sometimes," Ginger admitted. "He asks questions here and there, but I just tell him what he wants to hear. He trusts me too much to push." Her words were a slap to the face. She wasn't just lying. She was mocking me, painting me as a naive fool who didn't even deserve the truth. My blood boiled as I peeked around the corner, careful to stay hidden. They were on the couch, sitting close but not quite touching. Ginger leaned toward him, her body language casual, familiar, comfortable. Kyle sat with one arm draped over the back of the couch, exuding confidence. His smirk made my stomach churn. "So," Kyle said, a grin spreading across his face, "you think he'll ever figure it out?" Ginger smirked back, reaching out to swat his arm playfully. "Please." Chris wouldn't see it if it hit him in the face. That was it. I couldn't stay hidden any longer. "Try me," I said, stepping into the room, my voice sharp and cold. Ginger's smirk evaporated instantly. Her eyes widened in shock, and she scrambled to her feet. Kyle froze, his arm still draped over the couch like a statue caught mid-pose. "Chris," Ginger stammered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing home?" I ignored her, keeping my gaze locked on Kyle. "You must be Kyle," I said, my voice low but steady. "Nice to finally meet you." Kyle stood slowly, raising his hands in a weak gesture of surrender. "Hey man, look, this isn't what it—" "Don't," I snapped, cutting him off. "Don't insult my intelligence." Ginger stepped forward, her hands outstretched as if she thought she could smooth everything over. "Chris, please, just listen." "Oh, I've been listening," I said, pulling my phone from my pocket and holding it up. "I've been listening for a while now. You're going to want to hear this." I hit play. Their earlier conversation filled the room, each word slicing through the tense silence. "He trusts me too much to push." Ginger's face went pale as her own words echoed back at her. She opened her mouth, but all she managed was a stammered, "Chris, Save it." I cut her off, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "I don't want your excuses. I don't want your lies. I've had enough of those." Kyle, apparently not smart enough to stay silent, tried to speak. "Look man, I didn't mean—" "Shut up," I snapped, turning on him with a glare that could have set the room ablaze. "Get out of my house. Now." He hesitated, glancing at Ginger as if she might save him. But when I took a step closer, he bolted, practically tripping over himself in his rush to the door. I didn't watch him leave. My focus was on Ginger. She stood frozen, her hands trembling at her sides. "Chris, I can explain," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I laughed bitterly, a sound that felt foreign even to me. "Explain? You want to explain? Fine." My voice rose as I stepped closer. "Explain to me why you've been bringing some guy into my house, into my life, while I'm out there busting my ass to make sure you're taken care of. Explain how you can sit there, look me in the eye every day, and pretend everything's fine while you're sneaking around behind my back," I demanded, my voice trembling with rage. Tears filled her eyes, but they didn't stir an ounce of sympathy in me. She wasn't crying because she regretted what she'd done. She was crying because she'd been caught. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice cracking. It got out of hand." I shook my head, disgusted. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" I spat. "That's your excuse? You didn't mean to sleep with him? Didn't mean to mock me? Didn't mean to destroy everything we built together?" She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off, holding up a hand. "Save it, Ginger. I'm done." My words were sharp, final. "I'll pack my things or you can pack yours. Either way, we're done." Her face crumpled as the weight of my words hit her, but I didn't stick around to watch her fall apart. I turned and walked out of the house, my chest heaving with a toxic mix of anger, betrayal, and bitter relief. This wasn't the ending I wanted, but it was the one she'd earned. I climbed into my car, parked a block away, and stared blankly at the steering wheel, as if it might somehow hold the answers I was searching for. My hands were trembling, my heart still pounding in my chest like a war drum. The adrenaline that had fueled me was still coursing through my veins, but the reality of what had just happened was starting to set in. 8 years together, 5 years married, all of it destroyed in a single afternoon. The woman I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with, the one I trusted more than anyone, had stood in our living room, laughing about how easy it was to betray me. And Kyle? He wasn't just some random fling. He was the dagger she had chosen to plunge into my back. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles going white. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to break anything that would give me even a moment of relief from the storm raging inside me. But instead, I just sat there, staring out the windshield, as the weight of it all crushed down on me. This wasn't a bad dream I was about to wake up from. This was my life now. Ginger's face flashed in my mind, over and over again. The wide-eyed panic when I caught her. The fake tears she used to try to manipulate me. And her pathetic excuse, "I didn't mean for it to happen." But she had meant for it. Every moment of it. And the worst part? She didn't look sorry. Not for what she'd done. She wasn't crying because she regretted it. She was crying because she got caught. I glanced at the rearview mirror, catching my own reflection. The man staring back at me looked like a stranger, hollow, defeated, dead behind the eyes. My chest tightened as the humiliation and pain began to build again, but I clenched my jaw and forced myself to breathe. I had to get my head on straight. There was no way I was going back into that house. Not today. Maybe not ever. I didn't know what my next move was going to be, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let her walk away from this unscathed. Pulling out my phone, I texted Stanley. "It's done. I caught them." The dots appeared immediately, then vanished, reappearing seconds later. He was typing, stopping, then typing again, like he didn't know what to say. Finally, his reply came through. "I'm sorry, man. What do you need?" What did I need? That was the question, wasn't it? A time machine, maybe. A chance to go back to when everything still made sense. To when Ginger was still the woman I thought she was, and I was blissfully unaware of the betrayal unfolding right under my nose. But there was no going back. There was only forward. "I'll let you know," I typed back, shoving my phone into the cup holder. For a long while, I just sat there, staring at the rows of houses lining the street. Each one looked so normal, so peaceful, like nothing bad could ever happen inside their walls. But I knew better now. Neighbors strolled past with their dogs, kids played basketball in a nearby driveway, and cars hummed along as if it were just another ordinary day. But for me, nothing about it felt normal. My life had been flipped upside down, and the world just kept spinning, oblivious to the wreckage I was drowning in. After sitting in my car for what felt like hours, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let her think I was the one running away. If Ginger wanted to destroy our marriage, then she could sit in the silence of that house and deal with the fallout. I turned the key in the ignition, drove to the nearest hotel, and checked in under my name. I wanted her to know exactly where I was. The hotel room was small, suffocating in its blandness. The cheap artwork on the walls and the scratchy comforter on the bed didn't make it any better, but it was still preferable to being at home. I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty walls that seemed to close in around me. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, snapping me out of my daze. Ginger's name lit up the screen. My thumb hovered over the decline button, but at the last second, I answered. "What?" I said, my voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "Chris," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, we need to talk." "No, we don't." "Chris, I messed up. Okay?" she said, her voice breaking as if the tears alone would fix things. "I made a huge mistake, but we can work through this. We can fix it." I almost laughed at the absurdity of her desperation. Did she really think saying I messed up would magically erase what she had done? "There's no we anymore, Ginger," I said coldly. "You ended that the moment you brought him into our house. The moment you laughed about how stupid I was." Her crying grew louder, but it sounded forced, manufactured. "I didn't mean what I said. I was just, I don't know. I wasn't thinking. I was being stupid. Kyle didn't mean anything to me." "You don't laugh like that with someone who doesn't mean anything," I shot back, my voice sharp and cutting. "You don't sneak around for months with someone who doesn't mean anything. Stop insulting me with your lies." Her sobs turned into full-blown wailing. "Please, Chris. I love you. I don't want to lose you." "Love?" I repeated bitterly, the word burning in my throat. "You don't destroy someone you love, Ginger. You don't lie to them, humiliate them, treat them like a fool. You didn't just betray me, you broke me. Do you even understand that?" Her sobbing continued, growing louder, more desperate, but I didn't care. She could cry all she wanted. It wouldn't erase the image of her sitting on that couch with Kyle, mocking me like I was some clueless idiot. "I'm done," I said finally, my voice cutting through her tears. "We're done. I'll come by tomorrow to get my things. Don't be there when I do." "Chris, please," she started, but I hung up before she could finish. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the blank screen of my phone. I felt hollow, drained. That conversation had taken everything out of me, but at the same time, it left me with a strange sense of closure. She wanted to fix things, not for me, but for herself. She didn't want to face the consequences of what she'd done, but that wasn't my problem anymore. I looked around the hotel room, at the faded curtains and the generic, lifeless decor. For the first time in hours, I felt a tiny flicker of hope. This wasn't the ending I'd envisioned for my life, but maybe it was the beginning of something better, because now there was only one direction to go: forward. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, waking me up. For a brief moment, I didn't know where I was. The blandness of the room disoriented me, but then it all came rushing back. The hotel, Ginger, everything. This was my new reality. Then it all came flooding back. The confrontation, Ginger's desperate pleas, Kyle's smug face. The weight of it settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to summon the energy to face what came next. My things were still at the house. My life was still at the house. And Ginger, she was probably there too, waiting, hoping I'd walk back in so she could spin her web again, try to manipulate me into forgiving her. But I wouldn't give her that chance. After a quick shower, I packed my duffel bag and checked out of the hotel. The clerk didn't even glance up as I slid the keycard across the counter, which felt strangely appropriate. My world had imploded, yet everything around me carried on as if nothing had happened. The drive to the house was silent, the only sound the hum of the engine as I gripped the steering wheel tighter with every turn. The closer I got, the heavier the knot in my stomach became. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my chest was tight, and my breaths came shallow. Her car wasn't there. Good. She'd listened, at least. I stepped inside and was immediately hit by a wave of familiarity. The scent of home. Lavender candles, faint traces of coffee, and the fabric softener we'd always used. It punched me in the gut, a cruel reminder of the life we'd built together. A life she'd demolished. But this wasn't home anymore. It was just a shell, haunted by memories that now felt contaminated. The living room was unnervingly still. The couch, that couch, sat there, mocking me, a silent accomplice to her betrayal. I clenched my jaw and walked past it, heading upstairs to the bedroom. The bed was unmade. That was unusual for Ginger. She always insisted on making it first thing in the morning, claiming it set the tone for the day. It felt symbolic now, like even the bed had given up trying to keep things together. I grabbed a couple of suitcases from the closet and started packing. Clothes, toiletries, my laptop, anything that was mine and nothing that wasn't. I refused to take anything she'd bought, anything that might tether me to her later. As I zipped up the first suitcase, something on the nightstand caught my eye. My wedding ring. I hadn't worn it since last night, when I'd taken it off and left it there, unable to bear the weight of it anymore. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. The engraving inside read, "Forever E and C." A promise she'd shattered so completely that the word forever felt like a cruel joke. Without thinking, I slipped it into my pocket, not to keep, but because throwing it away right now didn't feel right. Downstairs, I loaded the suitcases into the car, keeping my eyes fixed forward. I avoided looking around too much. Every corner of the house was a landmine of memories I wasn't ready to face. Not now. Maybe not ever. I was about to grab the last bag when something on the coffee table stopped me cold. Ginger's journal. She always said writing helped her process her thoughts. It had become a habit of hers, something she did every day. My hands hovered over it, trembling slightly. I wasn't proud of what I did next. I picked it up, flipped it open, and began skimming the pages. Most of it was innocuous. Grocery lists, yoga routines, random notes about her day. But then I found a section marked with a small heart doodle in the corner. My breath hitched as I read the words. I feel so alive when I'm with Kyle. He makes me feel things I haven't felt in years. I know it's wrong, but I can't stop myself. A cold chill ran through me. My hands gripped the journal tightly as my eyes fell to the next part. I just wish Chris wasn't so. The sentence ended in a series of angry, chaotic scratches where she'd crossed it out. The ink marks were deep, frustrated, like she'd fought herself over what she wanted to write. I read it again. I feel so alive when I'm with Kyle. She wasn't sorry. She had never been sorry. I slammed the journal shut, my blood running cold as the truth settled over me. Her tears, her apologies. They weren't real. She wasn't crying because she regretted what she'd done. She was crying because she got caught. For a moment, I stood there, gripping the journal so hard my knuckles turned white. Then I set it back on the table, exactly where I'd found it, and grabbed the last bag. I didn't look back as I left. I didn't need to. That house wasn't mine anymore. It wasn't ours. It was just a graveyard for memories I no longer wanted. I loaded the last suitcase into the car and drove away, leaving everything behind except the pieces of myself I could still salvage. This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice, a selfish, deliberate decision to throw away everything we had built for a cheap thrill. My stomach churned with disgust as I slammed the journal shut and tossed it back onto the coffee table. I couldn't stay here another second. Grabbing the last bag, I walked out the door, locking it behind me for what I knew would be the final time. As I loaded the suitcase into the trunk, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't want to check it, but something compelled me to. It was a text from Ginger. "I'm at my mom's. Please, can we talk? I love you." The audacity made my hands tremble. She loved me? Loved me? If this was love, then I wanted no part of it. Without hesitation, I deleted the message. She didn't deserve my response. Sliding into the driver's seat, I glanced at the house one last time. It didn't feel like mine anymore. It wasn't home. It was just a building, a hollow structure where I'd once felt safe but now only felt betrayal. As I pulled out of the driveway, a strange cocktail of emotions washed over me. Grief for what I had lost, but also relief. Relief that I was free of the lies and the deceit. I didn't know where I was going yet. Maybe Stanley's place. Maybe somewhere far away where I could finally think clearly for the first time in weeks. But one thing was certain. I wasn't looking back. The person I had been, the trusting, naive husband who believed in Ginger's promises, was gone. Whoever I was becoming, he wouldn't be anyone's fool. By the time I reached Stanley's house, my mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. I hadn't even planned to go there, but somehow, my car seemed to steer itself. Maybe I needed to talk to someone who understood the mess I was in. Maybe I just didn't want to be alone with my thoughts anymore. Stanley answered the door in sweatpants and a hoodie, his hair a mess like he'd been raking his hands through it all day. His face tensed the moment he saw me, like he wasn't sure how this was going to play out. "Chris," he said cautiously. "You okay?" I brushed past him without answering and dropped onto the couch. My bags were still in the car, but I didn't have the energy to think about them. Stanley shut the door and followed me, sitting in the armchair across from me. "You look like hell," he said after a moment. "Feel like it too," I muttered, rubbing my temples. For a while, we just sat there in silence. Stanley didn't push me to talk, and I didn't feel like explaining. I could feel his nervous energy, though, like he was waiting for me to explode. Finally, I broke the quiet. "She texted me." Stanley's eyebrows shot up. "What did she say?" "She's at her mom's. Wants to talk. Says she loves me." I laughed bitterly, leaning back into the couch. "Love? Can you believe that? She's been sneaking around for months, and now she wants to act like she gives a damn." Stanley's jaw tightened, and he stared down at his hands. "She's not worth it, Chris. You know that, right?" I nodded faintly, but it wasn't that simple. The anger was still there, simmering like a steady flame. But underneath it was something I didn't want to admit. Grief. As much as I hated her, as much as I despised what she had done, there was still a part of me mourning the life we'd had. The version of Ginger I thought I knew. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked suddenly, my voice sharper than I intended. Stanley flinched, his head snapping up to meet my gaze. "Chris, No." I cut him off, leaning forward. "You knew. You saw them together. You threw that damn party to set me up. And you waited. Why, Stanley? Why didn't you just tell me the second you found out?" He swallowed hard, guilt etched into every line of his face. His lips parted as if to speak, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. "I didn't know how." "Okay," Stanley said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know how to look my older brother in the eye and tell him that his wife was cheating on him with some guy behind his back, that I didn't want to blow up your life unless I was sure." "Well, congratulations," I said bitterly. "You were right. My life's blown to hell." Stanley ran a hand through his hair, looking more miserable with every passing second. "I'm sorry, man. I really am. If I could take it back, I would." I wanted to stay angry at him, to hold on to the bitterness. But the truth was I couldn't. He might have handled it poorly, but at least he'd told me in the end. At least he hadn't let me live in ignorance forever. I sighed and leaned back against the couch. "It's not your fault," I admitted. "She did this. Not you." Stanley nodded, but his expression didn't lighten. He still looked like he was carrying the weight of my pain on his shoulders. "So what now?" he asked hesitantly. "You gonna divorce her?" The word hit me like a slap. Divorce. The end. The death of everything we'd built. I hadn't even said it out loud yet, but there it was, looming like a storm cloud. "I don't see another option," I said finally. "I can't stay with her. Not after this." Stanley didn't say anything, but the look on his face told me he agreed. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. We ordered pizza, cracked open a few beers, and avoided talking about Ginger. Instead, we shared old stories and laughed about stupid memories. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of something resembling normalcy. But no matter how much I tried to focus on the moment, there was a dark cloud hanging over me, a weight pressing relentlessly on my chest. That night, Stanley offered to let me crash in his spare room. I almost declined. I hated feeling like a burden. But the thought of another night in a hotel, or worse, returning to the house, was unbearable. I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling as my mind raced. The silence of the room was deafening, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Not the Ginger I had married, but the one laughing with Kyle, mocking me like I was some clueless fool. I couldn't stop thinking about the journal, about the words she had written. I feel so alive when I'm with Kyle. Had I been that blind? Had she been unhappy all this time, and I just didn't see it? Or was she just selfish, incapable of appreciating what we had? By 3 a.m. I gave up on sleep. I grabbed my phone and started Googling divorce lawyers in the area, making a list of names and numbers. I didn't know how any of it worked, but one thing was clear. I wanted her out of my life as quickly as possible. The next morning, I sent Ginger a text. "I'll be by the house at 3 p.m. to get the rest of my stuff. Please don't be there." Her reply came almost instantly. "Chris, please, can we just talk? Just once? I'll explain everything. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. It would have been so easy to give in, to let her talk me into staying, to slip back into the comfortable lie of the life we'd built together. But then I thought about the journal, the video, the way she had laughed with Kyle, so carefree and unbothered by the devastation she'd caused. I typed out a response and hit send before I could second-guess myself. "There's nothing to fix. You made your choice." Her reply didn't come, and I didn't care. By the time I left Stanley's house that afternoon, something inside me had shifted. I wasn't the same man I had been just a week ago, the man who trusted too easily, who believed in forever. That man was gone. And whatever came next, I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be anyone's fool again. Ginger would never hurt me again. That much I knew. By the time I pulled up to the house at 3:50 p.m., I had rehearsed my plan a dozen times in my head. Get in, grab the rest of my things, and get out. No lingering, no small talk, and absolutely no chance for her to manipulate me into staying longer than necessary. Her car wasn't in the driveway. Good. She had listened. Or maybe she hadn't, and this was just another of her games. A final act in the twisted circus she'd been running behind my back for months. Either way, it didn't matter. I wasn't going to let her win. The house felt cold when I stepped inside, though I knew the temperature hadn't changed. It was still technically ours, but it no longer felt like mine. The air was stale, heavy with the weight of betrayal that had unfolded within these walls. I hated how familiar everything was. The photos on the wall, the faint scent of lavender from her favorite candles, the couch where she and Kyle had laughed at my expense. It all clawed at me, but I shoved it aside and headed upstairs. The bedroom was just as I had left it. My suitcases from yesterday sat by the door, packed and ready. There were only a few more things I needed. My laptop charger, a box of sentimental items in the closet, and my dad's leather jacket, which I'd somehow left hanging behind the door. I moved quickly, throwing everything into a bag with no thought or ceremony. I refused to linger, to give the memories a chance to grab hold. But then, as I opened the closet to grab the box, something stopped me cold. A crumpled sweatshirt lay on the floor. It wasn't mine. My heart stalled, my thoughts spiraling as I stared at it. Could it be Kyle's? No, he wouldn't be stupid enough to leave something behind. Would he? I picked it up gingerly, holding it at arm's length like it might combust in my hands. It was gray with a yoga studio logo printed on the front. Ginger's, not Kyle's. But the scent hit me like a slap. Faint, musky, and unmistakably cologne. It wasn't mine. And it wasn't Kyle's either, at least not the cologne he'd been wearing when I saw him. My mind raced. How many men had she brought into this house while I was out working, breaking my back to give her the life she wanted? How many others had there been? And how had I been so blind to it all? The walls of the closet felt like they were closing in on me. My chest heaved as I dropped the sweatshirt like it was radioactive and stumbled backward. I couldn't let myself spiral. Not here, not now. I grabbed the box and the last of my things and headed downstairs, my footsteps heavy and hurried. I was almost out the door, almost free, when her voice stopped me dead in my tracks. Chris. I turned slowly, the weight of her presence hitting me like a tidal wave. She stood in the doorway, clutching her purse tightly against her chest. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her shoulders hunched like she was trying to shrink into the frame. Her face was pale, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "You weren't supposed to be here," I said coldly. "I know," she whispered, stepping inside hesitantly. I needed to see you. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stared at her, waiting for whatever excuse or plea she had rehearsed on the drive over. She took a shaky step closer, her voice trembling. "Chris, don't." I cut her off, my tone like steel. "Don't," I said sharply, cutting her off. My voice came out harsher than I intended, but I didn't care. "Don't say whatever pathetic excuse you've come up with this time. I've heard enough." She flinched as if I'd struck her. "It's not an excuse. Her voice cracked, and tears welled up in her eyes. "I don't want to lose you." I let out a bitter laugh. "You already lost me, Ginger. The second you brought him into this house, you lost me." Her tears spilled over, and she took another step forward, clutching her purse like it was the only thing holding her together. "I wasn't thinking, Chris. I know I messed up, but it didn't mean anything. Kyle didn't mean anything. Stop lying to me." I snapped, the anger in my voice cutting through the empty house. "I saw the messages, Ginger. I saw the way you laughed with him, the way you mocked me. Don't you dare stand there and tell me it didn't mean anything." She froze, her expression crumbling under the weight of my words. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was unhappy. I felt invisible." "Invisible?" I repeated, disbelief dripping from every syllable. "I gave you everything, Ginger. I worked my ass off to make sure you had a good life, and this is how you repay me? By sneaking around with him? With who else, huh? Kyle wasn't the first, was he?" Her eyes widened in panic. "No, Chris. There was no one else. I swear." I stared at her, her words ringing hollow in my ears. The crumpled sweatshirt in the closet flashed through my mind, its scent still lingering like a bitter reminder. She was lying. Again. "I don't believe you," I said flatly. Her lips trembled, but she didn't deny it. She didn't even try. That was it. The last thread holding me back snapped. "I'm done," I said, my voice hollow. "You've lied to me enough. I can't even look at you without feeling sick." She broke down then, her sobs filling the empty house as she collapsed onto the couch. The same couch where she had sat with Kyle. The same couch where they had laughed at me like I was a joke. I felt nothing as I watched her cry. No sympathy. No regret. Just an overwhelming need to get the hell out of there. "I'll have the divorce papers drawn up," I said, my voice as cold as ice. "Don't contact me unless it's about signing them." "Chris?" she choked out, her voice barely audible. "Please." I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I walked out the door, my bags in hand, and didn't look back. The air outside was sharp and cold, cutting through me like glass. For the first time, I felt the weight of what I had just done. I had ended it. There was no going back now. As I loaded the last bag into the trunk, a strange mix of emotions washed over me. Grief, anger, relief. The grief would linger, like an old wound that refused to heal. The anger would take time to burn out completely. But the relief, that was new, because for the first time in weeks I was free. As I drove away, the house grew smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely, fading into the past like a bad memory. It wasn't home anymore. It was just a house, a shell filled with ghosts, and I wasn't about to let them haunt me any longer. I drove for hours with no destination in mind, no plan. Just me, the hum of the engine, and the empty stretch of road ahead. I couldn't face Stanley's place yet. The questions, the pity, the well-meaning but hollow reassurances that time would somehow fix this. Instead, I drove until the chaos in my mind began to quiet, until I could hear my own thoughts over the storm. It wasn't until I pulled off at a rest stop outside the city that I realized my hands were aching. I had been gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers were stiff and white. I parked the car and stared blankly out the windshield at the blur of trees and muted fall colors. The silence around me felt deafening, but it was still better than the noise inside my head. The betrayal wasn't just Ginger's. It was mine too. I kept asking myself the same questions, over and over, like a broken record I couldn't turn off. How did I let this happen? How had I been so blind? How had I ignored all the signs? The late nights, the sudden yoga cover shifts, the way her laughter never quite reached her eyes anymore. It had all been there, right in front of me, and I hadn't seen it. Or maybe I hadn't wanted to. But I'd been too wrapped up in trying to be the perfect husband to see it. I had made excuses for her, brushed off her lies, convinced myself that we were just going through a rough patch, like all couples did. And now here I was, parked at a rest stop, with my entire life stuffed into 2 suitcases in the trunk. My marriage was nothing but ashes. I rubbed my face with both hands, trying to shove the storm of emotions back into some corner of my mind where they couldn't swallow me whole. But the worst part of it all wasn't even the affair. It was the laughter, the way she had laughed with Kyle, the way she had mocked me, diminished me, turned me into nothing more than a joke. I could forgive a mistake, maybe even a moment of weakness. But this was deliberate, cruel, calculated. And now I had to rebuild everything from scratch. I checked my phone, almost hoping Ginger had texted again so I could have the satisfaction of ignoring her. But there was nothing. No missed calls, no desperate messages begging for another chance. Good. But even still, a part of me wanted to scream at her one last time. To unload all the anger and heartbreak she had heaped on me. To ask her why. Not because I thought her answer would fix anything, but because I needed to hear it. I needed her to say it out loud. I opened my messages and started typing, my thumbs moving furiously across the screen. Why? Was it worth it? I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the send button. Felt weak, pathetic, but I couldn't stop myself. My chest was heavy with everything I hadn't said, everything I still wanted to say. Before I could second-guess myself, I hit send. Her response came almost instantly. She must have been staring at her phone, waiting for me to break. I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry, Chris. I never wanted to hurt you. Please, can we just talk? I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. It was the same script every time. The same hollow apologies. The same desperate attempts to reel me back into her web. Why, Kyle? I typed back. What did he give you that I didn't? The dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, then reappeared. She was typing, deleting, retyping. I could almost see her sitting there, fumbling for words that wouldn't sound as selfish and hollow as they actually were. Finally, the message came through. He made me feel special, like I wasn't invisible, like I mattered. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My jaw clenched, and I felt the familiar burn of anger rising in my chest. You mattered to me, I typed back. Was I not enough? Another pause. Then her reply came. You were. I don't know what's wrong with me. I ruined everything, and I hate myself for it. I almost threw my phone across the car. The nerve of her. To make herself the victim. To twist this into her own pity party while I was the one sitting here, picking up the pieces of the life she had destroyed. Good, I typed back. You should hate yourself. The dots appeared again, but this time, I didn't wait for her reply. I tossed the phone into the passenger seat and leaned back, staring at the ceiling of the car as the weight of it all pressed down on me. The truth was, her answers didn't matter. No explanation she gave would ever make this okay. She could apologize until the end of time, but it wouldn't change what she had done, or who she was. She wasn't the woman I thought she was. And maybe, deep down, she never had been. I stayed at the rest stop for another hour, watching cars come and go, letting the cold autumn air seep in through the cracked window. The quiet was almost soothing, the steady rhythm of passing vehicles like a metronome for my scattered thoughts. By the time I started the engine again, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to let her consume me. The anger would burn itself out eventually, and the grief would fade with time. But I wouldn't let her take anything else from me. Not my dignity. Not my future. Not the person I wanted to be. I wouldn't let Ginger or anyone else take that from me. When I got back to Stanley's house, I let everything spill out. Every word, every text, every ounce of the venom I had been carrying for weeks. Stanley sat there, listening quietly, his face growing darker with every detail I shared. When I was finally done, drained from reliving it all, he handed me a beer and tapped his bottle against mine. To moving on, he said quietly. To never being that stupid again, I corrected, taking a long drink. We sat in silence after that, the weight of everything hanging between us like a heavy fog. But for the first time, I didn't feel alone in it. Stanley wasn't perfect, but he'd been there for me when I needed him most. By the time I crawled into bed that night, my phone had lit up with another message from Ginger. I didn't bother reading it. I didn't need to. Her words meant nothing now. The truth was simple. She had made her choice, and now it was my turn to make mine. The next morning, I woke up feeling calm. Not peaceful. Peace felt miles away, but calm. Certain. For the first time in weeks, I had clarity. The pain was still there, sharp and unrelenting, but it no longer felt directionless. I wasn't going to let Ginger or Kyle or the mess they'd created control the rest of my life. Stanley had already left for work by the time I shuffled into the kitchen. A note was waiting for me on the counter. Take your time. Stay as long as you need. Beer's in the fridge. I chuckled softly, folding the note and tucking it into my pocket. Stanley had his flaws, plenty of them, but he'd stepped up when I needed him most. I'd never forget that. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone. Ginger had texted again late last night. Chris, I can't stop thinking about what I've done. Please just let me explain. I'll do anything to make this right. I didn't reply. What was the point? Her words were hollow, empty. She didn't want to make things right for me. She wanted to ease her guilt. But her guilt wasn't my responsibility anymore. Instead, I made another call to a divorce lawyer. The receptionist was polite but businesslike, scheduling a consultation for later in the week. When I hung up, I felt a strange mix of dread and relief. This was really happening. The life I had envisioned, the future I had spent years building with Ginger, was officially over. But at least now I had a plan. I spent the rest of the day tying up loose ends, canceling joint memberships, freezing the shared credit cards, making a list of everything I needed to move forward. The process felt clinical, almost cold, but it gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in weeks. By the time evening rolled around, I felt like I'd taken my first real step toward freedom. That was when Ginger called. I stared at the screen for a long moment, debating whether to answer. I almost ignored it, but something in me snapped. If she wanted to talk, fine. Let her talk. Let her hear exactly how little her apologies mattered to me now. I picked up, my voice flat and detached. What? Chris? She breathed, her voice trembling. Thank you for picking up. Look, I know I don't deserve another chance. But please, just hear me out. You've got 2 minutes, I said coldly. Go. There was a long pause, and for a brief moment I thought she might hang up. But then the words came, spilling out in a desperate, frantic rush. I don't even know where to start, she said, her voice breaking. I messed up, Chris. I know that. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I can't stand the thought of losing you. I made a mistake. A horrible, selfish mistake. But it didn't mean I stopped loving you. It didn't mean you didn't matter to me. I barked out a bitter laugh, the sound sharp and cold. Didn't mean I didn't matter? You've got a funny way of showing it, Ginger. Mocking me behind my back. Sneaking around with Kyle in my house. That's what love looks like to you. Her breath hitched. I wasn't mocking you, Chris. I swear I wasn't. It was just, I don't know. I felt like I was drowning. Like I wasn't enough for you anymore. And Kyle made me feel special. I interrupted, my voice cutting like a blade. Yeah, I read that part in your journal. You wanted to feel special. So you destroyed everything we had. For what? A few months of cheap thrills. Her voice broke again. I didn't destroy everything, Chris. We can still fix this. We can go to counseling, work through it. I'll do anything. Stop, I snapped, my anger surging like a tidal wave. Stop pretending this is about us. You didn't cheat because of me, Ginger. You cheated because of you. Because you're selfish. Because you're a liar. Because you don't care about anyone but yourself. Chris, please, she whispered, her voice trembling. No, I said firmly, my tone hard and unyielding. I'm done. I've been done. The papers are coming. And once you sign them, I never want to hear from you again. She started sobbing then, loud and raw, but it didn't move me. Not this time. Her tears felt like just another tactic, another way to manipulate me. Goodbye, I said, and I hung up before she could say another word. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at my phone. I should have felt triumphant, like I had finally taken back control. But all I felt was hollow. The truth was, I had loved her, despite everything. Despite the lies, the betrayal, the humiliation. A part of me had still clung to the woman I thought she was. But that woman didn't exist anymore. And maybe, just maybe, she never had. The next few days passed in a blur. Meetings with the lawyer. Packing up the last of my things. Figuring out what my new life might look like. Ginger tried to reach out a few more times, but I ignored her. There was nothing left to say. When the divorce papers were finally delivered to her, she sent one last message. I signed them. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me someday. I'll always love you. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling nothing. No anger, no sadness, no longing, just nothing. I didn't reply. Instead, I went for a long drive. The cool autumn air whipped through the open windows, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something that resembled lightness. Freedom. The future was uncertain, but it was mine again. As I turned onto the open highway, leaving the ghosts of Ginger and Kyle far behind, I realized something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope.